Thanks, Andy, for that introduction. And Dana wasn't joking when he said the lights are bright up here, so I'm going to try and smile at you, but I can't see you. So as Andy said, thank you. Oh, they dipped for a second. I'm Sam Gregory. I'm the Executive Director of Witness. For those who don't know our work, we work with human rights defenders and journalists worldwide who use video and technology. That includes traditional human rights activists, but a whole range of citizen journalists and citizen media. And as a consequence, we care deeply about the authenticity and trust in information, and we support very closely human rights activists at a grassroots level who are trying to create trustworthy information, and we work on the systemic technology shifts that impact our ability to believe what we see. And that is what, about 10 years ago, brought us into the space of authenticity and credibility, and about 5 years ago into the world of deepfakes and generative AI. Into a complicated environment where it's our job as Witness to try and enable the people we work with to continue to fortify the truth of societal events and documentation that matters. So today I'm going to take you through 3 areas. I'm going to talk a little bit about how human rights workers and human rights cares about authenticity, why it matters so much to us. Then I'm going to talk about what we have been seeing in terms of the trends in generative AI and how it impacts authenticity claims for us and for the journalists and human rights workers we work with. And then the third thing I'm going to do is I'm going to look ahead and say, how do we continue, hopefully, to get it right around authenticity and human rights? So let me start by asking you to put yourselves in someone else's shoes, in this case, created with Adobe Firefly. You've got the disclosure in the bottom left there. And consider what it's always been like to be a human rights defender, a journalist, or a citizen witness who exposes something uncomfortable. The first is it's very likely, if you document something important, that you will have it dismissed almost instantly as falsified, right? As did this Nigerian general of the evidence of the End SARS protests in Nigeria. You're also often at great risk. And Santi talked about this, the risk to photojournalists, human rights defenders are also often at great risk and making very contingent decisions about when they want to be visible, when they want attribution, how they manage their identity and their risk in the world. And although here I'm highlighting human rights defenders in Latin America, honestly, the same thing holds true if you're someone who witnesses police violence in the US. You're likely to be vilified, your account will be challenged, your life may be threatened. And we all grapple with what we call shallow fakes, recycled images taken from one context to another that claim to show one thing, but in fact show a different event, right? And this is one I've showed many times because I first saw it in 2007 at the dawn of the social media era. It's a horrible image of someone being burnt alive. And I saw it in one location, then I saw it in another country, then another country, then another country, constantly being recycled again and again as a truthful image when of course it wasn't. And as other earlier speakers have referred to, we're seeing this at massive scale right now in Ukraine and in Israel, Gaza. Images recycled for lols, for money, for disinformation. And we consistently have those in power rely on the doubt that is at the intersection of pure denial and technical mistrust. So this is Bashar Assad, the dictator from Syria, saying during the Syrian civil war, facing clear evidence of war crimes, it was not clear whether the attack happened or not, because how can you verify a video? You have lots of fake videos now. And it was in those moments in the early 2010s that human rights activists, working with others, and David Clinch mentioned earlier, the work of Storiful doing that early verification, started to think, how do we have the tools to make it easier to prove what is authentic and what is not? One of those tools is here today, and I'm proud to be in the room with Nathan Freitas from the Guardian Project. This was proof mode, and it originated in the crucible of those human rights crises of 10 years ago, of trying to prove what was real, what was faked, and what had been tampered with. So it was the urgency of these needs that brought Witness to, as Andy said, the start of the Content Authenticity Initiative, the start of the C2PA. And we came to this work with a critical but constructive viewpoint, because we care about the voices and the accounts of human rights defenders who are amongst the most critical users and potentially the targets of how authenticity infrastructure goes right or goes wrong. So you'll see on this screen, we published a report in 2019, and we said, here are 14 dilemmas to get right or wrong about building this type of infrastructure at scale. And I'm glad to see that many of these are being addressed in the CAI, but we always need to be asking ourselves the questions, what can go right and how does it go wrong if we're not paying very close attention to the people who are most vulnerable? And we've carried that attention over, I should say, very directly into the C2PA. So for example, Witness led the Threats and Harms Task Force in the C2PA, and we kept pushing on what are the potential harms and misuses and how Leonard and the rest of the technical working group could really respond to those. So since 2018, this work has overlapped with work on deepfakes and generative AI. So I want to now talk about that overlap. So we've led one of the leading civil society efforts to, as we describe it, prepare, don't panic around deepfakes and synthetic media. It involves talking to communities worldwide who face these threats of falsehoods, doing research, and then doing advocacy around policy and technical standards. And many times we're talking to the journalists, the fact checkers, the human rights defenders on the front line who don't want their faces incorporated into the next data set. So, with that said, listening right now to what people are saying, I want to share what it feels like and what people are concerned about at that intersection of generative AI, human rights, and authenticity. So I'm going to draw on a couple of key witness contexts to help inform you. In particular, two sources of information. First, these convenings I just showed you earlier. They took place this year in Nairobi, Bogota, and online. And then I just came back, I'm losing track of my time zones, 2 days ago from Singapore, where I spoke to about 450 fact checkers, journalists from across the Asia-Pacific region about what they were worrying about. And then the other source I'm going to come back to in a second is a deepfakes rapid response force we coordinate that brings claims of deepfakes, and perhaps real deepfakes, to a group of experts to make assessments to help inform journalists and fact checkers. So real-world examples of what's going right and wrong with generative AI and deepfakes. So, as has been mentioned, this is a year when close to half the world's population will go to the polls in 40+ national elections. There won't be another election year like this in a quarter century. And of course, in the Asia-Pacific region, because this is where I'm going to ground some experiences right now, you've got Pakistan, Indonesia, Taiwan, and India, among others. And then a whole year that leads up to maybe the Super Bowl of elections later this year in this country. Now, one thing I should say, heading to Singapore, I knew how many people have felt burned by the hype cycles around generative AI and around all this area, right? And so, selection of headlines here are claiming deepfakes, generative AI, we might call it now, are going to disrupt the 2018 election, the 2019 election, the 2020 election, the 2021 election, right? There's been a lot of hype around the impact of generative AI, synthetic media, and deepfakes on elections. So I don't know whether I was surprised or glad to hear when I started talking to people that they were genuinely worried about the threats this year, that the evolution of what is happening with generative AI and our ability to trust what we see and hear is getting harder, right? That it is actually now a genuine threat on the ground for the types of journalists and fact checkers and human rights activists that Witness works with. So let me share some of the things that they identified as key problems where they were looking for better solutions. So first thing to say is that shallow fakes, those recycled videos and images of conflict, of controversial events, are still the biggest day-to-day audiovisual deception problem. That may change and the balance may still shift towards generative AI. I think it will in some contexts. What this tells us actually is that some of the founding mission of CAI and C2PA, and Leonard mentioned earlier the shift as we sort of adapted to generative AI, that belief that it's important to know where something came from. Is there an original? Has it been manipulated? Still matters intensely, right? So let's not forget that that very core, just basic manipulation challenge is still really important to people grappling with this in the real world. The other thing they point to, and I'm so glad there is a session later today that really centers this topic, is falsified sexual images, targeting women, targeting teenage girls, targeting men with claims they're LGBTQ. That is a problem that we hear about consistently, targeting public figures, but also private individuals. and increasing falsified AI content, right? And we've talked about this earlier, and the big three sort of areas that people are actually seeing in the world: falsified audio. The example on screen is Keir Starmer, the UK Labour leader, but I heard examples from Indonesia, Bangladesh, Pakistan. We know examples from Slovakia, the US mayoral election for Chicago last year. Falsified images that get passed off as real. That image is a supposed image of Indian miners who were freed from a horrible accident last week that was shared by the leading Indian press agency as real. It's not, it's AI generated, but it got recycled and seeped into the media ecosystem. And then finally, synthetic media of people who never existed, either faces that cover up bots or, in some cases, synthetic video avatars. And the Israel-Gaza conflict, sadly, has also been a place where we see an increasing use of AI as a component in what we might call participatory propaganda from both sides, as you see in these celebratory, shocking, or inflammatory images. There are also claims that real footage is AI faked, such as the bottom left image shared by an Israeli influencer. It was claimed to show Hamas leaders living in luxury. Commenters then claimed it was AI generated. Then it was proved to actually be a recycled image from a previous year, and then it turned out it'd been upscaled with AI. So there was a lot of complexity about explaining that and explaining, say, a detection result, or explaining a reverse image search, and then explaining it to a public. The third category of content that we see extensively are these is it, isn't it claims about whether a footage is AI generated or not. This leads me onto the third category, and we're seeing this quite frequently, and it relies on the lack of clarity around both AI and its possibilities and challenges, and allows people to sort of plausibly deny what they want to ignore and plausibly believe what they want to believe, right? So when we're looking at these AI-generated images, people want to believe some images, and they want to deny some other images. And the place where we're seeing this very concretely is in this Deepfakes Rapid Response Force that Witness coordinates. It's a group of leading forensics experts, deepfakes experts who donate their time to analyze high public interest claims of a deepfake or claims that something has been made with AI. And we've recently handled 3 different cases from India, Sudan, and West Africa. In all 3 cases, people were claiming that these audio clips were deepfaked, okay? So we brought them to the force. In the first case from Sudan, they were able to fairly conclusively prove that it was real, not faked, despite all the claims. In the second case from India, the experts were not able to conclusively prove that it was real or faked because it had issues with background noise and it was sourced from Twitter, but the very strong likelihood was that it was real. And in the third case from India, it was a set of compromising conversations from a politician brought to us by the news outlet Rest of World. The experts analyzed the audio and concluded that at least part of it was very likely real. So you're hearing a lot of very likely, part of it, non-conclusive. And I think there's a real challenge in the world of how we recognize that even experts cannot make these conclusive judgments on the time frame that journalists want. And it's got very easy to make a case to someone that's been deepfaked, that's been falsified. It's a very easy thing to say in the world. I'm going to move to looking ahead in a moment. Before I do that, I want to pick up on a thread that I've heard a couple of times, and Matt from DARPA raised it earlier. In the real world, there is a constant demand from the people we work with for access and skills and training and resources around detection, as well as authenticity, because they exist in a messy world, and I think we're recognizing it where we need layers of solutions. So they know it won't be perfect. They know they're going to get something like a 0.87 confidence score. They know that they are going to need training to use it well, but they still want access to it, because they know that in the case of most of these clips I've shown, it won't have an authenticity or provenance signal, and they're still going to have to explain it to their publics or defend it as evidence, right? So alongside authenticity and provenance, I want to make the case for the messy world of detection matters in the real world for us to continue to invest in. And we need to follow the model of companies like NVIDIA that have actually stepped up and said, we're going to be part of the detection effort as well as the provenance effort. The final thing I'll say on that point is There's also a gap in access that is global. So major newsrooms in the US are starting to do pretty well on detection. Go to a major newsroom or a community media outlet in most countries in the world, and they have no access at all when it comes to all those elections we're describing in the next year. Now, I want to look forward amid this growing context of human and AI human media deception. And as we move forward with authenticity infrastructure and the efforts of the CAI and C2PA, how do we get it right for human rights, for people who defend human rights, and to ensure trustworthy information in our societies? There are 3 principles we use to ground our work at Witness around deepfakes, authenticity, and technology. First, we center those protecting human rights and democracy at the front lines, the harms they experience, and the solutions they demand. And I think we should always prioritize those who are most vulnerable when we think about solutions, technology solutions in society. We should place firm responsibility across the tech, AI, and information pipeline, and I'll explain a little more about what I mean about that. And we should push for human rights-based infrastructure, policies, and regulations. So those may all sound like big words. And I'm glad a lot of those big words are in the CAI's founding approach and in the C2PA's principles. Let me talk about how we make those actionable from the Witness perspective. The first thing is, from journalists and human rights defenders globally, we've heard a consistent interest in authenticity, provenance approaches across metadata, watermarking, and other disclosure methods. But it's always caveated with an understanding that provenance can provide a signal, not the signal, to support and fortify their work, but that's only if there's a nuanced design and implementation that reflects global applicability, avoids centralized control, and protects human rights. And only if these approaches don't unfairly shift the burden of proof onto people who already face a lot of challenges to trust in their information. So as these approaches gain prominence in both, obviously, technology company contexts and legislative approaches, here are some considerations to get it right. The first critical element, and particularly this because this is about the mix of human-generated and AI-generated media, is we need to ensure we're not making arbitrary correlations to identity. Let me make that direct. If you are a citizen journalist using your camera or a satirical maker using Midjourney, you shouldn't have to link your identity in order to use your camera or Midjourney, right? That is going to exclude the vast majority of people in many of the contexts I work from using these tools. We should be thinking very much about it as the how, not the who, of how media is produced. That doesn't preclude people including their identity. Many people want to include their identity in media. It's an incredibly legitimate thing to do, but we need to make sure it is not an arbitrary thing to do to include your identity or personally identifiable information. It needs to be opt-in. Second thing I'll say is regulation and norm setting is moving apace, as we've noted before. You know, we could look at the executive order, the G7 Hiroshima process, Vice President Harris's announcements at Bletchley Park, and in turn, recent legislation in Congress. And I've had the honor to testify on both sides of Congress in the last 2 months and to speak at the White House about these issues. And one thing I constantly emphasize is to recognize that the rules and the laws that get set in the US and the EU are going to be norm setting for the rest of the world. So we have to think, how will it play out in places that are less democratic, have more intrusive surveillance, more willingness to abuse these systems? Let me give 2 examples of potential abuse scenarios. In many parts of the world, there are fake news laws being passed month by month now. There has been a massive acceleration in the last few years. I just give one example here, a new Jordanian law that passed in August around fake news that is as much about suppressing dissent as it is about stopping people sharing malicious and false information. And then I will also note that we are about probably 2 days away from when the Indian government has said it's going to release a draft regulation on deepfakes in India, having announced that about 8 or 9 days ago. Both of those may be opportunities for great legislation. They may be also opportunities to suppress dissent and promote democratic drift towards authoritarianism. Authenticity and provenance, of course, also sit within a broader conversation around AI governance and AI transparency. The consistent feedback we've heard from people we work with is that this cannot be a responsibility on the end user. We cannot put the responsibility on users to spot AI-based media, to be able to guess it from the visual clues. And we can't just put this responsibility on the platforms. It needs a responsibility that goes back to the foundation models, to the deployers, if we're going to have robust signals of provenance, of authenticity, and fulfill our responsibility to the end users in a meaningful way. And I want to point to the PAI, the Partnership on AI's Responsible Practices for Synthetic Media, as a really good example of trying to start concretizing what it means to have that pipeline of responsibility. And finally, as we move forward to a broad ecosystem via the Content Authenticity Initiative members and the C2PA standard, a consistent demand we hear in my world is for tools and options for authenticity infrastructure that are available broadly and the power is not further centralized around trust. So we need a diverse ecosystem of tools that includes open source, options for high-risk environments, options that fit diverse global settings and constraints, and options outside of big tech. We need to support that diverse ecosystem if this is going to work. And we need to always ask this big picture question. It's a philosophical question, but it plays out in very concrete ways. On whom does this redistribute the burden of proof and trust? Are we helping those critical frontline voices to speak out, to be trusted, and to fortify their truth, or are we making it harder? I think we're going in the right direction. I believe the intentionality here, but we should always ask this question of any shift we make at a technical level, what is its direct impact on these most vulnerable voices? So when I talked to the launch event of the Content Authenticity Initiative about 4 years ago, I worried about negative futures and optimal futures. Clearly, authenticity and provenance is not a silver bullet, and its effects can cut both ways. It's maybe like a rusty musket bullet or something like that. I'm trying to think what the analogy is of not a silver bullet, but pretty good. But even as that, it can go both ways, right? So, if we get this wrong, we contribute to playing into the hands of those who do want to undermine trust, who do want to lean into a context in which it is harder to believe these critical frontline voices. If we get this right, we actually enable them. We make it easier in a much more complex world to be able to show your truth, to be able to hear that clearly when it is communicated to others, and to be trusted. So I want to just remind us of that stark contrast that we're also leaning into as participants in this ecosystem, and to remember that as we make our decisions. Thanks.